Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the importance of low resource experience when considering a career with MSF. It's wonderful to be joined tonight by people from across Australia, New Zealand, and the Asia Pacific. I would like, and we would like as MSF Australia, to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Boodja, the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm speaking from tonight. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. In recognition that we are a binational association, I also take this opportunity to say kia ora to our colleagues joining from New Zealand. My name is Jennifer Craig, and I am part of the international recruitment team with MSF Australia. Please do start sending through any questions that you have tonight, and we'll answer them after the conversation with our panelists. Do keep in mind that we're unable to answer any questions on your individual suitability tonight, but otherwise send your questions through to the website or to our YouTube channel. Now, applying to work for an organisation like MSF is something that people often think about for many months, if not years, before deciding the time is right to put in their application. This can be because of life commitments, or sometimes they feel, or we feel, that they need to gain additional experience in order to be successful in the complex and varied contexts in which we work. All international positions at MSF have a number of essential criteria that candidates must meet to be accepted into the recruitment pool, as well as core essential criteria that are common to all positions. Today, we're going to look at one of these key essential criteria that applies to all international positions with MSF, why it's important, and how to gain this experience to strengthen your application and make yourself more effective when in our projects. Specifically, today, we're going to be looking at the importance of experience in low resource settings, what this looks like in reality, and the sort of experience we look for in candidates. By low resource and remote settings, we mean environments with limited human resources, material, and equipment. This experience will help you to be flexible, creative, and able to work autonomously, all of which are very important in our projects. We're going to be speaking to two internationally mobile staff about the projects they've worked on for MSF, the experience that they found was helpful in preparing them for this work, and the experience they wish they had before going on their first assignment. First, I would like to introduce our panel members, Suzen Siew and Sophia Scrimgeour. Suzen Siew is a paediatric registrar and has worked in Australia and Malaysia and has recently completed her first placement with MSF in South Sudan. Welcome, Suzen. Sophia Scrimgeour is a medical doctor who's completed a fellowship through the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, as well as complementary studies in tropical medicine, palliative care, reproductive and sexual health, and women's health, and had extensive experience working in remote communities in the Northern Territory before joining MSF and taking a first departure to the Ukraine. Welcome, Sophia.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here.
Now, Sophia, I can see that you have had significant experience in the Northern Territory. What was it that drew you to this area of work? And did you find it was useful experience when you came to work for MSF?
Yeah, I might be biased, but I think working as a remote GP or rural generalist in Northern Territory is honestly a great job. I became captivated with it when I was actually a medical student. I went to Nhulunbuy in northeast Arnhem Land, and it's such a culturally rich place, a beautiful place. And watching the rural generalists work between the hospital, the private GP, and the Aboriginal medical services there showed me that they just got this privileged view into people's lives, their cultures, but whilst offering kind of emergency and preventative care and sort of public health close to people's homes. So I thought it was a safe place to kind of develop generalist skills in a relatively well-resourced environment, albeit the distance from a lot of the resources meant that you do get to develop that broad base of skills without all the kind of whiz-bang investigations and subspecialties that are available in tertiary settings. And as I went through my training, I actually really appreciated the teamwork that was required, particularly in the quite remote clinics where you kind of are working really closely with the amazing sort of remote area nurses, the Aboriginal health practitioners, the cultural kind of authorities in the community, the other services. Sometimes you've got a colleague GP and then calling city specialists regularly. And I think this teaches a degree of sort of flexibility, and also means that you kind of learned a bit of humble pie consumption, which actually was really useful in MSF settings. I think when you're in a remote clinic and you sort of been to a few clinics, you realise that there's people that have been in a lot of these places for a long time that really understand the context better than I, as a blow-in doctor, will ever understand. And so just to give heed to that. So yeah, I was really grateful for these learnings when I was on these mobile clinics in rural East Ukraine. It really helped with like the sort of confidence in decision making, the small team-based decision making that was required there, with the lack of diagnostics available, but also the cross-cultural communication in communicating particularly risk, so that we could sort of make shared patient-centred decisions. So yeah, I was really grateful for the experience I've had up in the Northern Territory.
Fantastic. And Susan, while you didn't have considerable experience in providing care in low resource settings, you did have experience working with people who were outside of the healthcare system in Malaysia prior to coming to MSF. How do you feel that prepared you for your first assignment? Susan, I can't hear you at the moment. Maybe without the headphones.
What if I just...
That's better. We can hear you now. Fantastic. In case anybody doubts whether or not this is live. Nope, you've gone again.
All right, I think this will have to do.
Fantastic.
Okay, sorry about that. So yes, as I was saying, I think one of the major ways it prepared me was just to process situations where you're feeling so limited in what you can achieve due to lack of resources. And of course, resource limitation is relative. And once you work across different contexts, it's really distressing when you know that patients can have better outcomes if only you had access to certain things. So in Malaysia, I worked with some groups that did not have access to publicly funded healthcare. And so often you could not achieve appropriate investigations, specialty opinions, treatment options. And with chronic diseases, continuity of care was often not secured. And when you combine that with language barriers, societal stigma, burden of trauma, it can be quite disparaging, and you often can't achieve what you might personally consider as optimal care. And that feeling of doubt often can set in, and you sometimes even wonder, oh, am I even making a difference in the grand scheme of things? But I think you'll learn to take the small wins, you get creative, you seek out more unconventional sources of help. And I think over time, these things can add up. And beyond that, you have to learn some acceptance that the inadequacies are not due to you as an individual, but really it's contributed to by systems. And I would say that to a certain extent, that helped me prepare emotionally and psychologically. Within a week of arriving in my assignment in South Sudan, I was facing patient mortalities, young children whose medical needs exceeded the care that we were able to provide in those settings. And it was a much more intense experience than I had ever encountered before, and certainly would not happen in Australia. I think it was important for me then to learn to accept that you can't always achieve everything you want to in the way that you think things should happen. And I think, we are often creatures of perfection. So I guess it was important to recognize for me the larger structures in which we were operating, and just to be more gentle and kind on the individual.
How do you feel that working across the two different systems, both Australia and Malaysia, helped you to prepare for working for MSF?
I generally think that working across different healthcare systems is always valuable because you see how different things can be done. Having worked in Malaysia specifically, it was helpful to be more familiar with tropical diseases like malaria, infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. But for me, I think the biggest asset I gained working across Malaysia and Australia was gaining experience in culturally safe care. I learned to better work within the cultural frameworks of the patients and of their families, just to ensure that the care I was providing was acceptable to them. Sometimes without that, you can't build the trust, and it can be very hard to achieve good outcomes. And what this looks like can be very different from situation to situation. In South Sudan, I recall a family wanting to bring their child out of hospital so they could burn a plant and make a sacrifice before bringing him back to continue to receive care. And I learned it was important to understand just the importance of cultural practices in order for patients to be comfortable with receiving treatment.
So MSF works in a variety of contexts and often provides care under extremely challenging conditions. To ensure that our international staff are adequately prepared for this, we look for experience in providing care in places where you might not have access to your usual resources, be it physical resources such as particular tools or medicines, or human resources such as being the sole specialist in a particular field and not having colleagues that you can collaborate with. Sophia, what was the biggest challenge that you faced?
So working in a cross-cultural sort of low resource environment where you don't have a lot of control and sometimes understanding of the broader decisions being made, I found at times difficult. So I guess similar to what Susan was just saying, I felt like sometimes we weren't doing enough. We weren't advocating in the most effective way or agitating in the right places to increase the quality of care that could be offered. And in debriefing afterwards, I found that this was a commonly kind of experienced set of feelings that people, particularly people after their first project, reported. But the chain of command in these particularly emergency settings is so important, and for sort of not only kind of coherent decisions and stakeholder sort of communication, but also for good patient care in these sort of often very time-sensitive locations. And I think it made me realise and reflect that in Australia, doctors and nurses are often in a pretty privileged position where we get to at least kind of get the opportunity to air our opinions and our 2 cents on how things should run. And particularly kind of in tight-knit remote clinics, it's sort of, there's the time and the place on a daily basis to talk about how we're running things. In contrast, sort of as a clinician on your first assignment, you'll likely, as I was, be quite low on the decision making chain, and not get to sort of input regularly into decision making. And then I guess also just communication. So my sort of 2 bosses were both learning English as their 3rd and 4th language, and at an incredibly faster rate than I have ever been able to learn a language. But it sometimes did make communication up and down and across difficult. And that, again, sort of made me reflect on my past privileges. And I think as someone that's had English as my first language, you do become a bit lazy, and sort of you get used to communicating with colleagues in English quickly, and kind of, using turns of phrase and wit that you think will, help with rapport, and it often things just fall flat when you're communicating with colleagues that have English as their 2nd or 3rd language. So, yeah, I think, again, it was just another point to sort of reflect on, and it initially felt frustrating, but it's reflective of my past privileges, yeah.
And Susan, what experience do you wish you'd gained before taking your first assignment?
For me, without a doubt, is very technically specific to having point of care ultrasound skills. I think that would have been just such a game changer for me. In all the projects that I worked on last year, we did not have access to any X-ray machines. We only had ultrasound machines, which I hardly had experience in using. And I was working very hard to upskill with online resources and uploading pictures online to MSF's telemedicine support. But yeah, this is something that I wish I'd come prepared with, as it would have made a big difference for me.
It's not an uncommon thing that we hear in feedback when people have returned from their first couple of assignments, is this reliance on reasonably basic technology. And I mean, we can obviously understand why that's the case. But this is why we look for experience in these low resource settings. But there can be quite a high reliance on ultrasound. I've never worked in a project with an X-ray, if that makes you feel any better. Although we do have some, of course. Midwives talking about how they've had to really rely on the clinical skills of using their hands more than they would in an Australian setting. It's just, this is exactly why we're talking about this tonight. Now, the other thing people are often surprised at is the size of the teams that they work with, and that they might often be the sole specialist in their area instead of operating within a team of colleagues like in their home countries. How did you find this, Susan?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend applying once you felt clinically ready. I think you will be already working well out of your comfort zone with limitations you may not have experienced before, and with a much smaller team and fewer people to rely on. I think you definitely end up carrying a much larger burden and responsibility when you are working in small teams. For example, the single surgeon in Benchu would do all the operations required, from trauma to general surgery, orthopedic surgery, obstetric cases. And I was just so impressed by surgeons who came with that breadth of experience. The anesthetist then had this portable anesthetic box and manually ventilated with a bag. I myself had to dig deep when I, as a pediatric registrar, had to manage adult patients on call, and that was also quite challenging for me. But yes, in 2 of the projects I worked in, I was brought on as the only doctor with any pediatric training to improve the capacity of the locally recruited staff and how they can manage children. And of course, 75% of the hospitals were children, and then every sick child became my responsibility unless their deterioration just wasn't picked up soon enough. So with that, there was just a lot of teaching and mentoring in my role, and I held a lot of training days for clinical officers and nursing supervisors as well, to try and improve the pediatric skills of the team.
Now,
Sorry, this is a big step up for me in terms of responsibility. As in Australia, I'd always have some form of clinical support, and I don't think I could have managed it with any less experience than I have, just bearing in mind that I'm also still in training in Australia. And I think that in many ways, while I embraced it when I was there, I think it was a huge learning curve, and I often do even look back until today and wonder if I would have made different decisions if I had more experience.
I think that's not that's not a feeling that leaves people. It doesn't matter how much experience you have, you're being put in situations where you are experiencing diseases that are much further progressed, or something that you haven't thought of before. And it's that challenge that brings people back, but it also that sort of opportunity to learn, but it can be quite confronting as well. I can certainly think of one returned nurse that we have who has considerable experience and still upskills every time she returns to Australia, because she says it's just, you always need to keep learning. How do you feel about that sort of feedback, Sophia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of my project wasn't at times as technically difficult, but you are absolutely always, it's the nature of these kind of projects, and the reason that MSF is there is you're going to be confronted with the unexpected in these sort of conflict or natural disaster zones, and you will be on the edge of your comfort zone, from your living perspective, from social perspective, from language perspective, and clinically at times. And so just having that experience behind you to have some confidence in some decisions that will be outside of the decisions you've made, unlike decisions you've made in the past, I think is really important. And it's what experience in different settings, and particularly low resource settings, can help with.
And of course, this experience is not just relevant to medical professionals. I started my career with MSF in logistics and moved into project coordination, and experience in low resource settings was also essential for these roles. Logistics with MSF can be an incredibly rewarding career. However, the stakes are often higher than they might be in your home country. Often there are no local shops to duck down to if an order's late. If equipment breaks down, there may not be anybody else to help you fix it. And of course, a lot of this equipment is critical. As a logistician, you may be responsible for managing a generator that supplies power to critically ill premature babies. And if something happens to that generator, you may only have a matter of minutes to ensure it's up and running again, or a backup generator is turned on to keep those children alive. As I said before, it's the challenge that keeps people coming back and the unexpected nature of the work, whether it's facing medical complaints you would never see in your home country or shouldering the responsibility for lives in a hospital if your equipment fails or fuel supplies run out. But it can also be a steep learning curve. And this is why we look for experience in facing these sorts of challenges prior to joining our recruitment pool. Now, another area that cannot be forgotten is living conditions. We always try to make these as comfortable as possible. However, the nature of the areas we work in mean that this is likely to be quite different to what you might be accustomed to at home. And this can create challenges for people if they've not experienced this before. It might sound like a small thing, but if you're in a professional position where you're facing significant challenges and a steep learning curve, and then you're also experiencing living in a group environment with considerably less comfort than you're used to, food you may not like, heat or cold, and potentially little personal space, this can add up to a considerable challenge for some people. Sophia, how did you find the living conditions in your project?
Yeah, mine was quite variable. So I was moving between two towns sort of every 3 to 8 days. So didn't really have a base. But one house was actually incredibly opulent, like more so than any place I'd ever lived. It was the only house in that area that had a bunker. And so it's the one that MSF took as our guest house, but it kind of meant marble everything and chandeliers. But even sort of within such a space, your personal space and privacy isn't guaranteed. So it was a bit of a hodgepodge sort of sleeping situation I was in, kind of an old walk-in robe at one point, and on the landing, the top of the stairs, at another point, and the lounge room, the sort of central part was the office. There was sometimes 30 people there working, and then at other times, there was usually kind of some hubbub going on in there. You just get used to kind of living in close quarters with a group of people. The other town, we were initially kind of in a pretty sparsely furnished office, which has sadly since been shelled, actually. I guess that brings me as well to the security side of things. So, like in sort of a lot of MSF, most MSF places that MSF are working, the security is really strict, and each place has got their own sort of security rules. But I think just getting used to the sounds of war in East Ukraine, one of the towns was 20 kilometres from Bakhmut, and so you would hear a lot quite regularly, and just kind of giving up that personal autonomy and agency, just doing what you're told, spending kind of often many days we couldn't leave our living guest house, and would be spending considerable time in the safe zones or the bunkers, and you do get used to it, but you just need to be ready to follow the rules and not question the rules when it comes to security.
Suzen, I can imagine that your experience of living conditions in South Sudan was quite different to what you're used to. How did you find it?
Yeah, absolutely. The living conditions were nothing like home, but it was okay for me. I stayed across a few different projects, and so living quarters were same like Sophia, quite variable. And I stayed in everything from tents to mud hut called tukuls, and to tukuls that were more modern, which were made of brick. We had cold showers, we had drop latrines in most projects. So this was fine for me, but I know that was not the case for everyone. And I know some were contemplating leaving quite early on just due to even the sheer number of insects. So this was seasonal, and sometimes you just couldn't go even 2 meters without a locust flying into you. And then there were other times with houseflies. So yes, it was not always, that was not for everyone. I arrived in the hot season, and so every single day was really over 40 degrees in a project that only had air conditioning in the pharmacy store. But in my opinion, that was actually great because it only got better from there. And by the time I woke up and it was 26 degrees in the morning, I was absolutely freezing. The food in our projects was quite different to what I'm used to. And, it's such a treat whenever people cooked meals or dishes from their home country. Yeah, but that being said, I'm a real foodie. I love talking about food, and I guess how little I'll say about food right now is probably more telling. So moving on, living in close quarters with people was also, I think that can also be challenging, especially when you've worked with the same people all day. The lines between work and living space definitely get blurred. In my project, we were fairly restricted in movements as well and spent most of our time between the hospital and the living compound. So it can get a little bit much. But overall, I think, you can get used to it pretty quickly. And I was always just acutely aware that our living conditions were still actually very good compared to what some people might face in the community around us. And so that made it definitely tolerable.
You bring back memories of meetings that I will never forget, where I had things like grasshoppers run up my skirt in South Sudan. I think it's a core memory. They stay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a lot of joy in working in these close-knit teams as well, and the relationships that people form, they last a long time. And I know that I still have friends from projects that I've been on, that I lived and I worked with, and we forged very, very close friendships. And I'm sure you've both had that experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Sophia, what advice would you give to somebody applying without experience in low resource settings?
Yeah, so I think consider getting sort of similar, or not similar, but experience that you can build on in Australia. And I think acknowledging that it is going to be different and you're going to have so much more support in Australia. I do think it's a great place to learn some core generalist skills. I think regional centres are really good places to start. So, speak to your colleagues about places, that have a good teaching culture. And it's a place that you could sort of work across a hospital. And just to give a toot for rural generalism and remote GP, if you are early on in your career and trying to decide which sort of specialty to go on into, I think it's a really great specialty. And so if you are thinking of that, then starting in regional centre where you can work across a hospital, develop those acute skills, and then also in the primary care environment, and then potentially see people across both settings is really rewarding. And then from there, if you wanted to go more remote, then you can develop those skills and become more independent in your practice. But any specialty, really, I think there's so many opportunities available in regional settings where you can be relatively well supported, but develop those skills without all the bells and whistles of investigations available that you get in the big tertiary centres.
If you could go back in time before your first assignment with MSF, what would you tell yourself, Sophia?
I think for me, just to be a bit patient, not get too caught up in my perception of the effectiveness of the project, sort of not actually well positioned to do so as a doctor, sort of at the coal face. I think there's, you can feed up, information and let people with a contextual view kind of consider these things. And so just concentrate on making the most of some amazing opportunities and amazing people that are that you're around, to just listen to them and hear about their experiences, because really that's what's stayed with me.
And Susan, what would you tell yourself?
I think mine was around safety. I think especially my family, they had a lot of concerns about safety prior to my first assignment, and especially when you are going to a country where the news will be very different from what you experience maybe on the ground. I think I would have liked to just have that reassurance that the safety within the organization of MSF is quite different and not comparable if you kind of think about the country as a whole. I actually think MSF was really good in terms of its security policies. And while I was on my projects, I never felt unsafe. But of course, situations can be unpredictable and every project is different. But I think as long as you're conscientious about following security protocols, I think, I would definitely like to be more reassured and reassuring to my family as well on that end.
Now, I do have one other question for you. Just drawing back to something that you said a bit earlier, what support did you find was available when you were making clinical decisions while on assignment?
Yeah, so I guess one of the features of low resource settings and working in small teams is that support is limited. In Australia, you'd have people just always like physically next to you or a phone call away that you'd be able to discuss difficult cases with, or any just to bounce off ideas about decisions about patients. I generally worked fairly independently, and when you needed support, MSF does have a telemedicine resource. So it's an online resource where you could put your case online and pose clinical questions to people with like for specialty advice. But yeah, it is often it's not a resource that's available um, at the right time. Sometimes you often go away from your cases, you get a response in 24 hours time, and that's a very good turnaround time. And often people in very high resource settings are answering your questions, so then they're proposing things that may or may not you may or may not be able to do in your project. They're often asking for investigations or asking for treatments that, again, lie beyond the scope of the project as well. I also had access to my technical referent. He was the pediatric advisor. I happened to meet him when I landed in South Sudan, and I think building that face-to-face contact meant that I could call on him in a pinch. But again, this is something that I think it would be challenging to do that on a daily basis.
How did you find it, Sophia?
Yeah, I guess similarly. Well, sort of when I was out on my mobile clinics, we usually didn't have internet, and so there's some paper MSF handbook. So there's an NCD handbook which I used a lot just to make sure I was sort of in line with MSF protocols in particular. But then when there's particularly difficult cases that fell beyond my scope and ones that I would usually be referring to a specialist, similarly I would come back at the end of the day and access the MSF telemedicine that Susan spoke of. But sometimes the answers, you try and provide as much context about your limitations as you can, but sometimes the answers are still asking for things that are beyond the scope of your context. And then otherwise, it might also be like a month before you can see that patient again. There might be no kind of phone access into that town, so you can't actuate the recommendations, and then sometimes you lose access to that community and that patient completely because of security issues. So there is some sort of help available, but we are severely limited in the time sensitivity. So you do need to be able to make clinical decisions independently at the time.
It's a difficult one because we try to give as much support as we can, but the nature of the context that we work in means that often you don't have access to the internet. Your phone may not work. You might not be able to quickly look something up. If you need to, you may have to duck out of the clinic and go up a nearby hill to get phone reception so that you can check something. It can be quite a confronting experience for people that are used to being able to rely on this sort of ready access to information that we have, and are then facing situations that they haven't experienced before and are having to think on their feet. So it can be quite a lot, and it's really good to be able to sort of reflect on this. I think it's a very useful exercise for people to sit and think through, well, what would I do if I was presented with this case that I haven't experienced before, and there isn't anybody else that I can ask immediately, and I don't have access to the internet? How comfortable am I in my clinical judgments and my clinical skills to be able to make this decision? And I think that's part of what we're trying to get at here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also develop your mechanisms within your context. And I think it's hard to predict outside the context, and you don't know who you'll be working with. But, like I said, acutely, I couldn't usually contact people. But at the end of every day, I would call. There was a Ukrainian doctor that would be in another town. So we were rarely in the same place, but we just debriefed every evening about the things we were seeing, because we were seeing similar things, and then develop sort of, talk over what we would do if we saw that thing, that issue or that problem next time in the context that we had. And that was really helpful for me. And I still sometimes clinically debrief with her sort of at the end of the day of a working day in Australia, just for sort of old time's sake. But also just it is really helpful when you can find people and that get the context and then have a way to work and talk through things, which is similar to remote Australia.
And that story actually takes me really nicely into the final question that I have for you. Sophia, what did you love about your first assignment with MSF?
It sounds cliched based on what I've just said, and I think it's sort of probably a pretty common answer, that it's the people, and we're so lucky to be able to go and work and live in these sorts of situations where we just get to meet people that are so incredibly resilient and have seen and gone through things that I could have never imagined, and just sort of being confronted on a daily basis with their generosity and their hilarity in the face of dealing with war, and then the ongoing friendships that come from that. So yeah, I feel really lucky from that perspective.
And Suzen, what was it that you loved about your first assignment with MSF?
Oh, look, I'm going to have to say the same thing. Yeah, definitely just meeting people from all these different walks of life, and them being quite letting them into your lives, and learning all these different ways, perspectives you can think about things. And that's just not just for the staff, but also the communities that accepted us there. And as a pediatrician in peds, I think we're often also lucky with the patients that we have. The kids are just such a source of joy when they get better and go home. It's fantastic. And I think that's, definitely one of the highlights as well.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you both had such positive experiences. Now, just to summarize, low resource experience is something that we look for in all candidates. And some of the ways that you might look to gain low resource experience are things like speaking to colleagues about rural opportunities that they might know of, considering working overseas or in remote communities to gain an insight into different contexts and cultures, getting experience working without the tools, medicines, or human resources that we usually rely on, and upskilling in basic techniques for your role. These are all the sorts of experiences that will enable you to contribute more effectively to your project and to weather some of these challenges that you'll come up against without finding it too overwhelming. Now, that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. I would like to thank both Sophia and Suzen for their time tonight and their incredible insights into working on an MSF project. And I think we will go over to the Q&A session. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jen.
I do see that there is one question here from the audience, from Stu, who has asked, how important is French when applying to MSF, as there are many countries that MSF works in that do not speak French. I'll answer this one. So bilingual capabilities are increasingly a requirement for MSF Australia. Knowledge of French in particular, or Spanish, or a commitment to learning these languages is an essential criteria now. Other languages, including Arabic, Portuguese, or Russian, can be considered assets. But if you're at the point in your career where you're considering that you might want to apply for MSF in the future, start with French. It will open up so many doors for you. And whether it's MSF or another international organization, it makes you a much, much more valuable candidate. So I would strongly recommend picking up French if you can. One of the other questions that has come through is for Suzen in particular. How did you deal with the high mortality rates on projects?
Yeah, look, good question. I think this, and again, I think this will be different for everyone. You will find your own coping mechanisms. But I think for me, just reaching out to the people who did give me support. So I think there are a few people who really walked with me throughout this journey. And yeah, I think also another thing, I do like to write. And so I did start out writing about every case that ended up with a big morbidity or mortality. And I think even within 1 or 2 weeks, I realized that was too overwhelming to do. And then it just came to a point of just being kind and gentle to yourself, doing what you can in the environment that you could within that context, and understanding that some of the things are really outside of your control. For example, I'd say there are cases that you would definitely not palliate in Australia, and from the moment they walk through the door, you know that you cannot achieve a cure. So we did not have any access to oncological services. So every child that came in with an oncological diagnosis was palliated in my projects. And I think just knowing that you wouldn't be able to achieve a cure, but you could offer just a better end of life care, just counseling to the family, giving them a better idea or of what's to come. I think you can still offer benefit in that ways, but yeah, you then just have to work through knowing that those children would have access to different treatments in another context. You just have to work.
Yeah, no, I understand that can be incredibly confronting, especially for paediatricians. It's quite a particular, I feel like as paediatricians, you often shoulder the brunt of that mortality, of course, though it does apply to many positions. One of the things I just wanted to add to that is that MSF does provide a variety of psychosocial support as well, both while you're on the project and when you return to Australia. So if you do want to debrief with people after your after your project or during your project, we do provide those services as well, without question. And it's something that we strongly recommend people take advantage of, because it can just help sometimes to talk it out. Now, Sophia, there's another question here from Alice. She's asking, what challenges could I expect to face on my first assignment, and how can experience in low resource settings help to equip me for these challenges?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer to that is expect the unexpected, and I think that is actually what experience in low resourced environments kind of helps provide, in that you just cannot predict what you will be dealing with, and the things that in a city there would be a separate service perhaps to deal with them, but you are the person sitting there who now is facing this problem, and so that sort of lateral thinking, problem solving skills is to any problem almost, and sort of using what you've got at the time to deal with such problems is, I think, the really valuable lessons that you get from working in remote environments. And so there's just each context that MSF work in is so different, and so it's a really hard thing to answer specifically, except for it's hard to tell. And so the skills that you can develop, the places that you can develop that lateral thinking and the problem solving skills.
Yeah. Now there's one more question here that I'll answer. It's asking how much weight is placed on working in remote Northern Territory compared to international work experience. And what I'd like to say is that we don't give greater importance to remote Australia against other international experience. What we look for is significant clinical or work experience in culturally diverse environments with limited human resources, materials, and equipment. However, experience working with other humanitarian organisations in contexts similar to those where MSF works is also of value. So it's more about the greater context than whether remote Australia is more valuable than international.
That probably speaks of my bias, sort of tooting the come and work in remote Northern Territory. But yeah, it's not just remote Northern Territory. And WA
I was going to
and
say
Queensland and lots of other places in Australia have amazing opportunities, and obviously overseas as well.
I would never forget in Tanzania driving down, we used to drive to the hospital down this one lane dirt road. And one of my drivers said to me one day, he's like, I bet you don't have roads like this where you come from. And I was like, I think you might be surprised.
And white Hiluxes that look very similar to and Troopies that MSF use in lots of different contexts. There's so many familiarities, aren't there?
Yes, yes. Now, I have a question here from Jake, and I might ask you this one, Sophia. He's asked, what were the printed resources that you were able to utilise without the internet? And did you have time to familiarise yourself with them before beginning your project in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So MSF is really good at MSF are used to working in places that we don't necessarily have internet. And so you can download all their guidelines offline, and there's an app in which you can download them as well. And yeah, I had plenty of time to familiarise myself in MSF. I spent in Ukraine, I spent a week and a half trying to get across to the east. And so a lot of time to sit there, kind of working through things and trying to prepare myself. So yes, make sure you make use of the meetings that you get in your home country before going, and really pick the brains of people that have worked in the context about the particular guidelines that will be useful. And yeah, it's really because you want to be working, have a set of drugs that are maybe different to what you've seen, and it's really important for continuity that you are using MSF protocols and MSF guidelines.
Did you have anything to add to that, Susan?
Yeah, I have to agree. I had, even though internet access wasn't stable, you do have time. MSF has lots of guidelines themselves that are tailored to these different contexts, and are also tailored to the resources that you have, like the types of medications that you'll have. And it is really important to follow those guidelines, because if a new internationally mobile staff comes and does something different every single time, it can be very difficult for the project and for the locally recruited staff as well. But yeah, I definitely had time to read before my project, and I had time to read during, long evenings in the assignment as well.
I just wanted to add to this a logistics perspective as well, because these guidelines are not just for medical placements. We have very, very strict guidelines in logistics as well. And when I was working in Tanzania, we were running a hospital in a refugee camp and providing all of the services for the refugee camp within this hospital. Now, of course, because it's an isolated hospital in a refugee camp, we also had to manage all of the waste ourselves, which is not something that you would necessarily, in fact, it's probably not something you would do in a hospital in Australia. But what it meant was that we had to have a sharps pit, which we had to build, and was built very much to specifications. And MSF is very strict on how we do these things. We had to build an incinerator, which again, we got very specific specifications for, including the material, the size of the steel, all of these sorts of things, because it has to burn at a certain temperature to be sterile. So it's really important that you follow these guidelines. And we had an organic waste pit, which is where all of the organic waste from the hospital would go. And again, that's built in a very specific way so that once you're finished with it, you close the pit up. And after a certain number of years, it's considered safe to decommission. And so it's very scientific. We've been doing it for a very, very long time, and the guidelines are there for very good reason, to keep everybody safe, even after we go. And a sort of an example of that was, we took over this hospital site and somebody else had been running it previously. And once we started digging in one area, we found a whole lot of old needles because they hadn't used a sharps pit. And so we're very aware that we may not be there forever, and whoever comes after us needs to be safe as well. So there are guidelines for all positions, and for good reason. But it can be an incredibly interesting job. Now, Look, that brings us to the end of our session today. If there are any more questions that people want to pop up online, we will get back to those and make sure that we answer them. But I really wanted to thank both of you, Suzen and Sophia, for your time tonight and for sharing your incredible experiences. So thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here and good to hear about Suzen and your own experiences.
Yeah, good to meet you through this as well. Yeah, really fascinating how different things can be.
It really is. Thank you.